Hi, friends. I hope you had a nice long weekend. Um, Ours was quiet. We didn't go anywhere. We didn't do anything. Although Benny and I did convince Mr. Lavoy to do some grilling, and that's like my favorite thing in the world is to eat food from the grill. So that was cool. Anyway, back to the grind. We are in the middle of reading Mrs. Jaffe is Daffy. It's very weird, this book. Not that the others haven't been, but this one seems exceptionally strange, if you ask me. We are on chapter number 8, Mrs. Jaffe's Evil Plan, page number 71, if you're following along with me. After we dried off and changed our clothes, it was time for lunch in the vomitorium. Me and the guys sat at one table. Andrea and her girly friends sat at the next table. Mrs. Jaffe was walking around with a basket. "Who wants a hard tack?" she asked. "A heart attack?" I asked. "Why would anybody want one of those?" "No, no, silly," Mrs. Jaffe said. "Hardtack is a kind of cracker that soldiers ate during the Civil War. It's made from flour, salt, and water. I baked this batch myself, you betcha." Hardtack sounded totally disgusting. Ryan said he would try a piece because, he will eat anything, even stuff that isn't actually food. One time he took a bite out of a seat cushion on the school bus. Ew. Mrs. Jaffe gave Ryan a piece of hardtack. He bit into it. "Well, it tastes like cardboard," he said. Only Ryan would actually know what cardboard tasted like. Who eats cardboard? Ryan is so weird. The rest of us told Mrs. Jaffe that we didn't want any hardtack. She said she had to go back to her office. "I can't wait until Civil War week is over," Michael said. "Yeah, and Mr. Klutz will get back from principal camp," said Neil the nude kid. "Mrs. Jaffe is so weird." "Maybe Mrs. Jaffe isn't a real vice principal," I said. "Did you ever think of that?" "Yeah," said Michael. "Maybe she kidnapped our real vice principal and has her trapped in a bamboo cage that's hanging from a tree in the jungle. Stuff like that happens all the time. "Stop trying to scare Emily," said Andrea at the next table. Emily looked like she was going to cry, as usual. "I'll tell you what I think," said Ryan. "Mrs. Jaffe is trying to take over Mr. Klutz's job. She didn't send him to principal camp so he'd be a better principal. She sent him to principal camp so she could have him murdered." "No," said Emily. "That just can't be true." "I saw that once in a movie," said Michael. "I bet Mrs. Jaffe is sitting in her office right now stroking her cat and plotting how to murder Mr. Klutz. Villains always stroke their cats while they plot how to murder people." "Well, we've got to do something," said Emily, and then she went running out of the vomitorium. And do you know what? For once in her life, Emily was right. We did have to do something. We all scraped off our trays. Instead of going out to recess, we slinked down the hall to the office. We were slinking around like secret agents. It was pretty cool. Finally, we got to Mrs. Jaffe's office, and the door was open, but just a crack. We peeked in. And you'll never believe in 1,100,000 years what Mrs. Jaffe was doing in there. She was stroking a cat. "See," Michael whispered, "I told you. She's plotting to murder Mr. Klutz." "Howdy, guys and gals," Mrs. Jaffe said suddenly. "Come on in, meet my new kitten. His name is Mr. Fur Columbus." "He's adorable," Andrea said, running over to pet the cat. "No, he isn't," I said. "That cat is evil, and you, Mrs. Jaffe, will stop at nothing to turn your evil plan into reality." "Huh?" Mrs. Jaffe said. "What evil plan?" "You want to be principal, don't you?" asked Michael. "Well, yes, maybe," Someday, I suppose, said Mrs. Jaffe. Aha, Ryan said. So you admit it. You sent Mr. Klutz away to be murdered so you could take over the school. Oh my gosh. Oh, that's silly, Mrs. Jaffe said. I told you, Mr. Klutz is at principal camp. Liar, I shouted. Here, I'll prove it to you, Mrs. Jaffe said, pulling a piece of paper from her desk drawer. And this is what it said. Dear Mrs. Jaffe, I'm having a wonderful time at principal camp. This morning we made lanyards. We also had rock climbing, archery, and parachuting. I hope to learn how to swim tomorrow. I never learned when I was a boy. Tell the kids I miss them. Sincerely, Mr. Klutz. And then there was a photo of Mr. Klutz paddling a canoe. See, I said to Andrea, I told you they have canoes at principal camp. Well, I guess you're not planning to murder Mr. Klutz after all, Michael said. Of course not, said Mrs. Jaffe. We all stroked Mr. Fur Columbus before we left, but I didn't trust either of them, not for 1 minute. I was sure Mrs. Jaffe had something up her sleeve, not just an arm. Until tomorrow, friends.